It's Andy here with this week's video sermon recap. If you're in a bridge group, you already know that this video sermon recap is going to be the last one for a handful of weeks because we're ending one bridge group season and we're going to take a break before we relaunch again maybe towards the end of the summertime. If you were with us on Sunday or you watched online, then you'll know that we were continuing in our sermon series called The People of the Way. And throughout the book of Acts, we've been pausing and we've been just examining the lives of different people. And we've been asking ourselves questions about what do they have to show us about what it means to be disciples of Jesus. And this week was no different. Pastor Danny, he talked to us primarily about three different characters. And they're kind of these people in the book of Acts that fly under the radar a little bit. They might not move the needle like Peter or Paul or one of the big, heavy hitters that we might be thinking of. But Apollos, Priscilla, and Aquila. Very fascinating people, and there's so much to say. And I'm going to kind of brush with big, broad brush strokes just to kind of get the wheels turning and remind you of what you've already heard. But the first thing I want to remind you of is that we meet these three people in the book of Acts chapter 18. Pastor Danny paused and he pointed out something super significant. It's that the gospel of Jesus, in its very core, at the foundation of what the gospel is all about, is about breaking down dividing lines and barriers that human beings create between themselves. You know, us humans, we have this nasty tendency throughout history to separate ourselves and push different people to the side and try to raise ourselves up as high as we can, even sometimes at the expense of others. And it was no different in Jesus' day and the days that followed. You see, Priscilla and Aquila, they're this married couple, and Pastor Danny pointed out something super significant. It's that as followers of Jesus, the Bible lists this couple with Priscilla's name first. Priscilla and Aquila. Well, that's significant because Priscilla, the wife, was living in a world where women were often demeaned. Oftentimes in legal proceedings, women were not even considered full human beings. Yet the Bible that we read, the Bible that we base our lives on, at that time puts her name first, in the place of prominence, even above her own husband. What that has to teach us is that Jesus is in the business of demolishing things that separate us. For the sake of unity, all people are invited to follow him and live into the callings that they have. It turns out that Priscilla is a powerful woman. She's a wonderful leader. In fact, the Apostle Paul says that he couldn't even do his ministry without her. The next character that we meet in Acts chapter 18 is this guy named Apollos. He's kind of an obscure character, and we learn a little bit about him. The first thing we learn is that he's from Alexandria. Alexandria is in Egypt, and it was known as this kind of philosophical hub of learning and expertise and education. Just by mere fact that Apollos is from there and he was educated there makes him extremely high standing in the ancient world. Well, Apollos, he takes this 5-day journey to a foreign land. He's not from there, but he finds his way to this city called Ephesus. And it's there that he begins to speak from the scriptures. He's a powerful orator and communicator, and he begins to tell people about Jesus. Well, it's in Ephesus that Priscilla and Aquila, they begin to hear Apollos teach, and they're blown away by the gift of God in him. But they also recognize something else. It's that Apollos does not know the full scope of the good news of Jesus. It's hard for us to really wrap our minds around, but in the ancient world, you couldn't just go to the library and grab a Bible and read the whole thing from front to back. You were kind of at the mercy of which synagogue and which church had which scroll and how you could possibly read them or hear about them. Well, it turns out Priscilla and Aquila have maybe heard more of the good news and more of the accounts and stories of what we know as the New Testament. And so they invite Apollos to their home for dinner. In the ancient world, if you were kind of living in that culture, one of the things that might be fascinating is that Apollos was likely thought of as a very high-standing person in his home country, but in Ephesus, he's a stranger and a foreigner. To invite somebody into your home is to basically invite them to be connected to you socially, and you would have your names kind of in the same sentence. And that was a big deal. It was an intimate connection. Yet Priscilla and Aquila, they invite Apollos, the foreigner, over. Pastor Danny pointed out again that this is at work, the gospel of Jesus, breaking down dividing lines. In their culture, Priscilla and Aquila would have been taught that you would never invite someone like Apollos over for dinner, but they do. And when Apollos gets there, what they do is they begin to teach him more about the gospel of Jesus. The Bible says they teach him more adequately. Now, I love this part because Apollos is an intelligent, smart guy. He's probably significantly more educated than his hosts, Priscilla and Aquila. Yet instead of digging his heels in and being arrogant and prideful, he accepts their teaching, and because of it, not very long after he has dinner, he launches out into a very successful ministry of his own. This is kind of the gist of the ministry of the sermon, and we had multiple examples of the way that God is in the business of breaking down dividing lines and barriers. Pastor Danny challenged us as the sermon began to kind of come to a close to ask ourselves, where do we start as we begin to try to live into some of these principles as followers of Jesus? And he kind of left us with two things. The first thing comes from the book of Joshua. I think it was Joshua chapter 5. And it's this story where Joshua, the leader of the Israelites, he's gathered the people around him and they're getting ready for battle against Jericho. A really formidable opponent with lots of firepower and swords and chariots and all these sorts of things. And right in front of him appears a heavenly messenger with a giant sword. Probably a really scary sight. And Joshua does what I think I would probably do. He says to the divine messenger, "Whose side are you on?" AKA, are you going to fight for us or are you going to fight against us? And just like God often has a habit of doing, he says through the messenger a third option. Not are you on our side or their side. He says this, neither. I'm not on your side or their side. And then he reminds Joshua, where you are standing is holy ground. Take off your shoes and recognize the holiness of God in your midst. I think what Pastor Danny was saying, what I really took with me is that God is inviting us to be on his side. God is not in the business of choosing sides between two human arguments or, one group of people believes this, another group believes that. Which side is God on? God is in the business of inviting you and inviting me to be on his side. And the way we know his side is by remaining close to his heart through reading the Bible and through prayer. So where we start when we begin to live out the principle of God breaking down barriers and boundaries and raising people up who are thought of as nothing into places of prominence and leadership, the first thing we have to do is to recognize that God is inviting us to be on his side. He's not inviting us to ask him to be on our side. The second and last thing that Pastor Danny challenged us with is to really reconsider what it means to follow and worship idols. He used an example of King Asa from the Chronicles. And in the Chronicles, King Asa is this righteous king. And the first thing that he does is he begins to eliminate and destroy every single thing that could lend to worshiping idols. He breaks down altars and he gets rid of people who pronounce false gods. And as I was thinking about this, I called to mind something that somebody taught me a long time ago. You're probably like me. I'm not in the habit of worshiping a golden calf or a statue that I created for myself. And so we might be caught thinking that, idol worship just isn't a problem for us anymore. Somebody once upon a time challenged me to think of it this way. Where do you spend your time, your treasure, and your talent? Those three things, where you spend your time, your treasure, and your talent, will tell you where you value things most and what things that you worship and set your life up to value. I don't know about you, but there's some convicting things in there. King Asa was all about setting up his time to worship the Lord, to use his treasure, the things at his disposal, to make sure that God was honored and worshiped, and to make sure that all of his talents and the people around him were set up so that they could live into the calling that God had for them. If you're in a bridge group, you're going to have some wonderful opportunities to discuss some ways that God might be breaking down some barriers and boundaries in your life and in our world and our culture around us, and how we can more faithfully live as disciples of Jesus. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I look forward to seeing you in person very soon. Blessings, friends.